All right. Good deal. Oh, I see the Archbishop isn't on here yet. All right. Well, hey, while we're waiting on the bishop, hey, just remind you guys, if you can see here, I'll just zoom in. Tonight's third night of Hanukkah. Lit my menorah for tonight and did my prayers. So just remind everybody that it is that season as well. All right. Hey, can everybody hear me? All right. Hey, while we're waiting on the Archbishop, I don't know what kept him. I mean, you know, you got Father Paul, you got and both Father Pauls, I should say, at the same time, and myself. Hey, Steve, Terry, Jack, I know all you guys, if you guys got any questions, you know, right now is a good time to chime in because you're going to get a wide variety of expertise. You know, Father Paul's a doctorate or working on his doctorate, probably one of the most knowledgeable guys I know on about any subject. So, Terry, you always have Bible questions. Now's the time. You're in front of like the best guys in the world to be sitting.
Oh my goodness, you put me on the spot. But I actually did cross something this morning. reading in 1 Samuel. I think I was in chapter 15.
Okay, what did you come across?
I came across where a curious verse that's always sort of intrigued me about that God allowed an evil spirit to enter into Saul.
Yes.
I can't remember the number. And that sort of gave me some pause because I didn't really ever think of God as allowing evil spirits to enter a human being. I know we can do things that invite them in by, interest in the occult, that sort of thing, mediumship, but I did not know that God would actually do that. And that just sort of took me aback a bit. I'm not sure I quite understand that.
Well, I'm going to give one version. Father Paul Castellano will probably dive in. I'm trying to grab that. I know exactly where you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's flip back to Job. All right. So really, Job's the first book of the Old Testament, and we know that the devil went and came to God. I mean, he just openly comes and goes, ups and downs, and walks right in and says, "God, blah blah blah, your servant Job," and then God kind of takes a standoff approach and said, you can do anything you want, but you can't touch my servant Job. And so, the devil went about his business and destroyed Job's family, and Job kept the faith. Job stood there and said, okay, so all these other bad things were happening around Job. But Paul, not Paul, remember that Saul reluctantly, God said, hey, I'm going to make you my God. Hey, I'm going to make you the king. He didn't want to do it. He made him his anointed one. So he was watching over him. So at that time, God was basically saying, hey, I'm not going to let the evil ones come upon you. I'm going to put a hedge. He basically was telling the devil, hey, stand back. Don't touch my boy. He's my boy. I can't do that. But when he kept disobeying God and took an ignorant spirit upon himself to think he was greater than all, then God didn't just say, hey, all right, evil spirit, you go into that person. All he did at that time was say, whoa, all right, I'm not protecting him anymore. Whatever you want to do, you can basically do. So it wasn't God commanded anything to do anything to him. It was just that God stepped back and kind of took his protection off of him. But God doesn't order the evil ones to do anything. The evil ones do what they do of their own dominion and fall into evil ones. Father Paul, you want to jump in here? Because I know you definitely probably have a little different take than I do.
Father Patrick touched on one of the foundational principles that has to be encountered when we deal with these types of issues, and that is God's sovereignty in relationship to God's sovereignty in relationship to the world, but specifically in relationship to the spiritual realm. If you will notice as you read through Job, everything that occurred within the first few chapters of Job, specifically the first 3 chapters, as Satan was approaching the throne, he was querying God and attempting to cast, as a prosecuting attorney, doubt on God's fidelity. And what winds up happening is that God, as the sovereign of the universe, throws it back at Satan, and he essentially says, okay, this is my servant. Now, why don't you test him? And the key thing here isn't whether or not God does this or does that or does the other thing. The key thing to keep in mind is that Satan cannot do anything. The realm of the fallen spirit cannot do anything unless sovereignly permitted by God to do that. So that's the backdrop of what's going on with Saul. The second thing we have to keep in mind is that even though Saul was the king of Israel, according to the Old Testament, specifically the promise given by Jacob, by Israel to his sons, the scepter wasn't going to be with Saul at all. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. And according to Genesis, the scepter will not leave the tribe of Judah. And the scepter was always indicative of the reign of a king within the ancient Near East, but specifically within Israel. So on the one hand, we have God sovereignly controlling all events to the degree that evil can only approach an individual if God permits that to occur. The second thing is the individual in which we're speaking specifically now, Saul, had this evil event occur to him. And what has to be kept in mind is that Saul, and there have been discussions about this over the years, but Saul was never a believer, not in the sense that we understand what it means to be committed to Christ. Saul was always an outlier. So you have a man who was voted the king, and by virtue of the fact that the people begged God for a king, they were rejecting God in favor of being the very thing that God did not want them to be, and that is like every other nation. So when you put those things together and you understand Saul's relationship or lack of a relationship to God, how he treated God's anointed, who was first Samuel, then David, Samuel the prophet, then David the future king. One of the ways of interpreting what happened to Saul was that God sent a spirit to judge Saul for his disobedience. Now, God would never send a spirit of that ilk to judge a believer in that manner. But when it comes to pagans, let's face it, the manner in which pagans respond to all things is according to their nature, right? They're going to act according to their nature. And the nature of every pagan is what? Fallen. It's sinful. Matter of fact, from Genesis 2, we see that God made it very clear, and we always overlook this particular understanding of Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 is a bifurcated punishment. What does God tell Adam and Eve? You can eat of every tree in the garden except for this one. You eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and what's going to happen? The day you eat of it, you're going to die. Well, that's a bifurcated judgment, because on the one hand, Adam and Eve did not die. Physically, they lived. They began the process of death, but physically they did not die. So from that very command, we see initially God pours out his grace even in the command to judge. So he gives Adam and Eve the grace of survival, if you will. He did not kill them. But on the other hand, he did implement judgment, and that judgment was that their spiritual nature died. And that's picked up by the Apostle John and the Apostle Paul when it talks about the nature of man who is outside the kingdom of God. They are by nature dead in their trespasses and sins. So any individual who is functioning from that standpoint, from a non-Christian standpoint, is going to function from the standpoint of acting according to their nature. Saul was acting according to his nature, and his nature was a nature of sin. So God, as he did in Genesis, very simply could have sent that spirit as a spirit of judgment on Saul. Now, there are other interpretations, but that's one of the more standard interpretations.
Right, because when I read it seemed like it was an actual, he was allowing Saul to be possessed.
Well, understand the difference between allowing a spirit to come upon somebody and allowing a spirit to dwell in someone. Those are two different things. So the spirit could have did you ever see any of those? I hate to use the illustration, but did you ever see any of those silly horror movies where you get demons coming out and they're attacking people from the outside? I mean, it's a silly illustration, but that is a good way of looking at what was happening to Saul. It wasn't that the demon took residence within Saul, so to speak, but we call it oppression. The demon could have externally been oppressing Saul and moving him in such a direction that he would have been automatically falling into his own natural desires, and his own natural desires would have been evil. So, and then God now judges Saul in his actions.
And you are correct, sir, because it said that the demon would come in and out of him, and that's when David would play the harp for him, is when this was occurring. Right.
Yeah, everybody automatically assumes that when we talk about what occurred with Saul, that it is an automatic demon possession, that the spirit indwelt Saul. Well, not necessarily, not if you read the text. The demon came upon him. The demon may have come in, screwed up his head a little bit, and then taken a powder and gone someplace else. But for the most part, God was sending that demon to oppress Saul. Saul was then driven to act according to his sinful nature. His sinful nature compounded the judgment that God was going to place on Saul, and therefore Samuel comes in and tears the kingdom away from Saul later on because of these events.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
That's very good.
It is very much so. That is quite an intriguing verse.
Cool.
Well, Father Paul, you know what? I'm still the Padawan, still working under the master, still trying to learn. So you see what I have to deal with every week, man. She drills me. There he is. All right.
Well, as is the want of technology, and why I sort of have a fit and die quiet every time they say that some signaling system has gone over to fiber optic operation, is my internet connection died at 6:28, which means I have to reset everything. That takes about 20 minutes. Okay, I'm here now.
All right, jump right in and go ahead.
We've got to approximately 1770 last week, and 1770 really marks a sea change in the fortunes of the Church of England. The Whig ascendancy of the early 18th century comes to an end, and there's a much more positive relationship between the government and the church under George III. The Whigs had been adamantly opposed to any sort of a provision for bishops for North America, having rejected proposals made in 1723 and again in 1747. Two bishops of London during that period, the most notable one of the two being Edmund Gibbon, had refused to exercise jurisdiction in North America in the hopes of forcing the government's hand to establish a bishopric over here. Strangely, it was the American Revolution which loosened things up so far as the government in London was concerned. We've all heard the story of Seabury's irregular consecration in Scotland, but that prompted the English government to introduce a bill in 1786 to permit the consecration of bishops for overseas dioceses. And there were two separate provisions in this act, the first of which dealt with the consecration of 3 bishops for the Protestant Episcopal Church in the USA. The first 2 to be consecrated under that provision were Samuel Prevost and William White, who were consecrated on the 4th of February 1787. Then in 1791, James Madison was consecrated for Virginia. Also contained in that act was a provision for the consecration of a bishop for Nova Scotia. And the Reverend Charles English, who had been rector of Trinity's Church in Wall Street before the late unpleasantness, as it were, became the first bishop of Nova Scotia. 6 years later, a second colonial bishopric in the form of the Diocese of Quebec was established by Act of Parliament, and thereafter there's a steady trickle of colonial bishoprics established, acknowledging the idea that the Church of England was moving from being essentially an insular organization confined to England, Ireland, Wales, and in its sort of disestablished and rather irregular version, Scotland, to being something that went wherever the British went. So after the establishment of the Diocese of Quebec, the next establishments are the Diocese of Antigua and Leeward Islands, Jamaica, and Calcutta. So you can see the gradually widening influence of the High Church movement under George III, because it's very much driven by two related pressure groups. The better known of the two is the Hackney Phalanx, which was a group of High Church. It was actually led by Joshua Watson, but it was a mixture of clergy and laity who pushed for the traditional marks of Anglican Christianity. So they wanted a colonial episcopate. They wanted better ecclesiastical discipline. They wanted a reduction in the problem of non-residence. They wanted more churches built. It's a very traditional high church program. And they were linked with a group called Nobody's Friends, which consisted largely of senior lawyers at Lincoln's Inn's Field and Gray's Inn, who were able to put pressure on the government to bring reforming measures into Parliament for the benefit of the church. The first one of these is the Colonial Bishoprics Act. Then in 1801, after poor old William Van Mildert gets hauled up for non-residence, the act governing the non-residence of ministers is revised. Van Mildert had a small problem. His parish was St Mary le Bow in London, which is a tiny geographical parish. And although he lived literally 10 minutes walk outside the parish, he was technically non-resident. And some busybody decided to shop him for the 40-shilling reward for being a non-resident clergyman, even though he was as good as resident in the parish, because the Non-Residency Act dated from the 1530s and was intended to provide information by the use of informants. So there's a subtle modification of the terms of non-residence in 1801. The next reforming manoeuvre is an attempt by the government to provide additional churches, and this is brought into being by what's commonly referred to as the Million Act of 1819, which is one of the measures introduced by Lord Liverpool's government as a thank offering for Britain's victory over France at Waterloo. So the churches that are built under the Million Act of 1819 are very often referred to as Waterloo churches. And this considerably streamlined the process by which parishes could be subdivided, because you have the ridiculous situation in the early 19th century where many English parishes had not been divided or subdivided since the 14th century. So, for example, you had the parish of St Giles in the Fields in London, which contained some of the most notorious criminal slums in London and had a population of 30,000, presided over by one clergyman and 2 or 3 curates who could not enter certain parts of their parishes without the danger of being pelted with stones and assaulted pieces of filth. and I'll leave you to work out what filth was given the standards of street sanitation at the day and the amount of horse-drawn traffic, and hoots and catcalls. So there was a need for a streamlined system to divide parishes, to endow parishes, to reform the machinery of the church. And although it's the mid-19th century reformers that get credit for this, it's actually the Hackney Phalanx, Nobody's Friends, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, the Tory governments under William Pitt the Younger and Lord Liverpool and the Duke of Wellington that push forward this process of basically gentle reform, making it easier to build new churches, to divide parishes, to make the machinery of the established church more efficient. And it's also a period when the old-style high churchmen dominate the episcopal bench of the Church of England. It starts with the replacement of a typical Whig low church appointment, Frederick Cornwallis, as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1783 by John Moore. John Moore was not one of the pampered aristocrats of the church. He was the son of a butcher. He'd been a scholarship boy at Oxford. He came up through the church the hard way, and he was to be Archbishop of Canterbury for 21 years. And he is the man who is behind measures such as the Act that enabled bishops to be consecrated for the United States, the Non-Residence Act. He begins the moves towards the effective establishment of a colonial episcopate. His successor, Charles Manners Sutton, who's exactly the opposite. He's the grandson of the Duke of Rutland. He was effectively George III's personal chaplain. And he became Archbishop of Canterbury in a way that only the old regime in England could have come up with. When George III heard that John Moore had died, he walked up to the deanery in Windsor where Charles Manners Sutton was residing, and he got the dean up, because the Bishop of Norwich was also Dean of Windsor, got the dean up from his dinner table, and the king stuck his hand out and said, "Congratulations, my Lord Archbishop," swung on his heels, went back to his end of Windsor Castle, and the next morning when William Pitt turned up from London to nominate his old tutor as Archbishop of Canterbury, George III greeted the request with the words, "Can't do it, already given it to Tomlin." What? Charles Manners Sutton turned out to be an unusually effective Archbishop of Canterbury. His connections with the aristocracy meant that any move towards reform on his part, such as the Million Act, was able to secure a smooth passage through the House of Lords. He understood the parliamentary processes. He was able to work hand in glove with successive Tory administrations to alleviate many of the contemporary problems of the established church. Of course, being part of the old regime, he never gets the credit he deserves, because most of the history books that were written in the 19th and the early 20th centuries were written by either evangelicals or Tractarians. And the people that they really despised were the old high churchmen, because the old high churchmen were men who worked with and through the system. If they achieved any sort of revolution at all, they did it by the traditional means of applying pressure to the right people in Parliament, using their influence, forming broadly based committees. All very boring, all very unspectacular, all very establishment. But a large measure of reform was achieved by people like Charles Manners Sutton. For example, one small change is that most of the bishops who were appointed from 1785 onwards were either scholars of high caliber or preachers of high caliber. A typical CV for a Lord Liverpool bishop is demonstrated by the Reverend William van Mildert, who was successfully Bishop of Llandaff and then Prince Bishop of Durham. And he was born to a moderately prosperous Dutch family that had settled in London. They were gin distillers, no surprises there, given that they were A, Dutch, and B, living in London. And he went to Oxford. He did moderately well in the old unreformed university. He was ordained, and he began to develop a reputation for scholarship whilst he was a curate in a series of small parishes in the southeast of England. He was eventually preferred to the living of St Mary le Bow in London. From there, he became preacher to Lincoln's Inn Fields. That was a natural springboard to the Regius Professorship of Divinity at Oxford, which had just been vacated by William Hooley, who had become Bishop of London and was later to become Archbishop of Canterbury in succession to Charles Manners Sutton. And from the Regius Professorship, he went to the Diocese of Llandaff in 1819 and did something really radical. He actually lived in the diocese. Now, Llandaff was worth about £900 a year. To set that in context, that's about as much as, say, the deanery of one of the less well-endowed cathedrals. So in order to survive, the Bishop of Llandaff had to be a pluralist. And in William van Mildert's case, it was arranged that as Preterman Tomlin, William Pitt's former tutor, had finally got a richer bishopric. He'd been moved from Lincoln to Winchester. The deanery of St Paul's Cathedral was vacant, so that would be given to William van Mildert to provide him with both a house in town so he could attend Parliament and also the income to be Bishop of Llandaff. And this sort of pragmatic arrangement is very common in the early 19th century. Van Mildert was very definitely a reformer, but he tended to achieve reform by the use of the existing resources of the church. Towards the end of his life, he set in motion the foundation of the University of Durham. And in order to provide an endowment for the university, he released some of his own lands as Bishop of Durham to be an endowment for the new university. He also annexed 2 canonries of Durham Cathedral to the chairs of divinity and also of Hebrew to be established in the new University of Durham. And he also insisted that anyone who graduated from the University of Durham should subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England before receiving their degree. Now, if you graduated from an English university at any time before 1871, you had to subscribe to the 39 Articles. Now, if you went to Cambridge, you could complete the degree course without subscribing to the articles, the same arrangement as Durham. If you went to Oxford, you had to undertake to subscribe to the 39 Articles on Matriculation. There's rather a nice story about Oscar Wilde when he went up to Oxford in the 1860s. He arrives in the university and the Dean of Hall asks him, have you subscribed to the 39 Articles? And he replies, I'll subscribe to 40 if you like. But this whole connection between the church and the university is very important when you're looking at the evangelical movement and the Oxford movement in their natural environments. Cambridge is very much associated with the evangelical movement. Why? The important figure there is Charles Simeon. Simeon spent the whole of his adult life in Cambridge. He goes up as an undergraduate in 1777. He's converted to Christianity whilst he's at Cambridge. He's ordained by the Bishop of Ely. He receives his first curacy at St Edmund's in Cambridge. A few years later, he's preferred to the living of Holy Trinity, Cambridge. He is a fellow of King's College, Cambridge. He's associated with the city all through his ministerial career from 1783 through to 1836. And the reason why Charles Simeon is important is he began to give attention to the professional training of the clergy. And he used to have a Sunday evening, basically tea party in his rooms, in which he would invite undergraduates who were thinking of ordination to come and learn the basics like sermon composition. He would talk to them about theology. He would tutor them in pastoral care. And it also spread the influence of the evangelical movement up and down England, as parishes were filled by graduates of the University of Cambridge who had been through the hands of Charles Simeon. Just across the road in Trinity College, Christopher Wordsworth, who was a fellow of Trinity, was very interested in securing the most talented academics for the service of the church. So he builds up a large collection of talented clergy who he places with other members of the Hackney Phalanx in order to receive their training as curates. So people like William Lisle, who is later to be Dean of Canterbury, his own sons, Charles and Christopher, are both farmed out to other Hackney Phalanx members to be educated in being good high church parsons. Christopher Wordsworth the Elder is quite notorious for having hung on until Sir Robert Peel was Prime Minister in the mid-1840s before resigning as Master of Trinity to ensure that another high church Tory would be the next Master of the College, to ensure that the values, the high church and Tory values of the college would be carried forward into the next generation. Oxford, on the other hand, goes a more academic route. You have a series of fairly efficient professors of divinity, particularly the Regius Chair. William Hooley, in his 5 years, lectured in person. William Van Mildert, in spite of the nasty comments made by Charles Lloyd in the 1820s, seems to have been primarily resident at Oxford, and he changes the gearing of the Regius Professorship more towards preparing men for the ministry and less towards a rather anodyne and rationalistic theology. Van Mildert is also remembered as being the editor of Daniel Waterland's works, which were at that time one of the standards for Anglican divinity. And it'll give you something of a flavour of William Van Mildert's position if I read you a couple of extracts. The first one comes from, is a series of quotations from a sermon he gave at Lincoln Inn's Fields, first in 1812 and then again in 1817. Van Mildert registered meticulous protest against the profane or idolatrous tenets of the Romish Church, adoration of the host, the worshipping of images, invocation of the saints, and such like unscriptural devotions. On revising the sermon in 1817, he added invocation of the Blessed Virgin to the blacklist. The Roman liturgy, however, despite being in Latin and clogged with superstitious and exceptionable forms, was in many places truly scriptural and well calculated for the comfort and edification of pious worshippers. Some of the most admired parts of our Book of Common Prayer were taken almost literally from the Romish ritual. So in other words, Van Mildert is staking out a position which is Catholic but Reformed. And then he moves on to his comments about the Reformed churches. Impressed at first with just indignation at the corruptions of the Church of Rome, they seem to have thought it impossible to separate from her too widely, and in their zeal to correct abuses, to have forgotten that to reform is not to destroy. Hence the primitive ordinances and even the primitive faith of the purest ages of Christianity have by some of these churches been rudely shaken or inconsiderately abandoned. In some, episcopacy has been totally abolished, and with it, many essential qualifications of the priesthood. Others have prescribed the use of any precomposed liturgies. Almost all have, in some particulars, relinquished doctrines or ceremonies, plainly deducible from primitive and even apostolic practice, as well as agreeable to the general tenor of the Scriptures. This is very much Van Mildert staking out the traditional middle ground of the Church. And he goes on to say that reform, while sometimes unavoidable, was always dangerous, potentially an opening for a vast inundation of licentiousness and disorder, which is the Tory speaking. And it's this atmosphere that's very much part of the church in the early 19th century, because there's a vast worry created by the French Revolution. Even relatively liberal figures in England dial it back after the Reign of Terror breaks out in France. And much of the politics of early 19th century England and much of the church life of early 19th century England has to be seen in the context of the French Revolution, which means that responsible opinion swings heavily in favour of traditional usages, traditional institutions, and the demand for reform is abated in the fear that it will lead to revolution. Unlike the American Revolution, which had been very much undertaken by, for, and under the guidance of the ruling class, the French Revolution was propagated by demagogues and carried into effect by the mob. And this had a profound effect on religious opinion in England. It also, strange as it may seem, did an awful lot to remove the hostility towards evangelicalism and towards the creation of new parishes. The evangelicals were seen as a bulwark against atheism and revolutionary principles. Reform of the church was seen as a way of undergirding the God-given structure of the English settlement. And so, throughout the early 19th century, you have church and state working hand in glove to improve the status of the church, to maintain traditional institutions, and to foster an atmosphere in which the traditional English values are maintained. But there's a subtle change in the church in that evangelicals become acceptable. George Ryder becomes Dean of Gloucester, and then he becomes Bishop of Gloucester and eventually Bishop of Lichfield, the first evangelical to be a bishop in the Church of England. He is followed a few years later by the two Byrd brothers, the two Sumner brothers, John Byrd and Charles Richard, who are connections of William Wilberforce's. They become bishops respectively of Llandaff in succession to William Van Mildert, and then John Byrd goes to Chester in 1828. The Byrd-Sumner-Wilberforce connection represents the old evangelicalism, which isn't really low church. It loves the Book of Common Prayer. It loves the Bible. It loves the 39 Articles. It loves liturgical worship, but it also loves personal religion. It's a protest against the formalism of a lot of mid-Georgian religious life. And people like the Birds would maintain, the Sumners would maintain doctrines such as the apostolic succession or baptismal regeneration within the framework of a broader evangelical theology. And of course, being evangelicals, they were reformers. C.R. Sumner, when he goes to Llandaff, follows William Van Mildert in residing in the diocese. But he's also the first bishop to do something serious about effectively ministering to the growing industrial population of the Welsh valleys above Cardiff. Scarcely a year later, he is transferred to the Diocese of Winchester, where he presides for some 40 years, gradually introducing reforms, dividing parishes, organising rural deaneries, providing a proper structure to support the clergy. John Bird Sumner goes to Chester, where his first act is to establish the Chester Church Building Society, because he's looking at the teeming thousands of Birkenhead and Liverpool with inadequate church provision and sees a need to build churches. In his 20 years as Bishop of Chester, he consecrated something like 120 churches. And this pattern of activity is maintained not just by evangelical bishops. High church bishops like John Kay of Lincoln or Charles Blumfield of London are also church builders, organisers, reformers. The church is moving gradually into the 19th century and becoming effectively organised to meet the challenges of an industrialised society. And a lot of this involves voluntary effort through societies, such as, of course, the old ones, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and SPCK, are supplemented by the Church Missionary Society, founded in 1799, which works to carry Christianity throughout the British colonies. That's followed a few years later by the British and Foreign Bible Society. And the contrast between evangelicals and high churchmen in this period is, to use a somewhat whimsical phrase of David Holmes, the American church historian, the evangelicals are basically Catholic evangelicals. The emphasis is on the evangelical side of Christianity, whereas the high churchmen are evangelical Catholics. They differ not in doctrine, but in emphasis. The high churchman emphasizes liturgy, the church hierarchy, the need for a commitment to the ordinances of the church. The evangelical emphasizes personal religion, preaching, the necessity of conversion, but neither rejects the key principles of the other. So you have a harmonious effort, harmonious for the most part, between high churchmen and evangelicals to promote real religion in England. And alongside this is a program of social reform. Pious evangelicals like the Earl of Shaftesbury were not content to merely convey an impression of Christianity as being pie in the sky when you die. They wanted to do practical things to alleviate the conditions that existed for the working poor. So you have the great campaign against such things as boys being used as chimney sweeps. Now, the Irish used to stuff a goose down the chimney. Apparently in London they used to stuff a small boy up the chimney in order to carry the brushes. And the risks of asphyxiation, the lung problems caused by soot, meant that many of these boys didn't make it to be 20. And it was seen as one of the crying scandals of early 19th century London. Another great evangelical campaign was against men and women being forced to work too many hours in the new factories. So you get a series of reforming acts which limit the working hours that can be imposed by factory owners. You have a series of acts outlawing things like bear baiting on the grounds that, to reduce the amount of cruelty to animals. William Wilberforce was one of the early patrons of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And it's probably typical of the English that we had a Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals before we had a Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. I'll let you think about that one for a minute. And as a result of this, the evangelicals are very much associated with social reform in the early 19th century. Another thing that's very characteristic of 19th century England is the English Sunday. The blue laws that prohibit Sunday trading were intended not as a killjoy measure, but to ensure that shop girls and office boys and caretakers had some sort of time off to call their own. And there's an obsession in the early 19th century amongst evangelicals with improving the lot of the working poor. Now, some of the legislation is a bit retrograde. The workhouse, on reflection, did not turn out to be a particularly good idea. But the desire for social reform, for Christian action in ameliorating the conditions of society, went hand in hand with evangelical religion. And also on non-party projects, such as the 10-Hour Act and the early acts concerning cruelty to animals, high churchmen and evangelicals worked hand in glove. And this cooperative spirit continued well into the 1840s. But what begins to destroy it is the rise of the Oxford movement. Now, history is always written by the victors, and American church history is nearly always written from a high church point of view. And by high church, I don't mean the old sort, I mean the Tractarians and their descendants. And as a result of this, the great mid-19th century boom in the membership of the Episcopal Church, which was largely a result of evangelical activity, is overlooked. In a similar way, the destructive side of the Tractarian movement is ignored because it upset the old working alliance between moderate evangelicals and high churchmen, the alliance that brought reforms such as the new bishoprics in the colonies, the new bishoprics in England, steps to augment livings and to reduce pluralism, the foundation of the ecclesiastical commissioners. All that good stuff came through the working alliance of evangelical and high churchmen. But the Tractarians and their Anglo-Catholic successors tended to be a group that regarded themselves as the church and everybody else either as a potential ally or a potential enemy. And this means that much of mid-Victorian church history is occupied with a very negative phenomenon. The battle between evangelicals and Anglo-Catholics for dominance in the Church of England. And unfortunately, it's a little bit like World War I without the Weimar Republic surrendering in November 1918. It ends up being a stalemate. And it's a stalemate that lets the liberals through the middle to dominate the history of the Church of England in the 20th century. The main point of Anglo-Catholic intransigence is their refusal to accept the authority of the Reformation. They always look either back before the Reformation to the early church, which didn't upset traditional high churchmen, or they looked to that strange organisation with its headquarters by the River Tiber, otherwise known in mid-Victorian England as the Italian Mission to the Irish, also known as the Roman Catholic Church, for their ideas of liturgy and pastoral care. And that antagonized a great number of good church people. And of course, with the Anglo-Catholics agitating one way, you get the evangelicals agitating the other. So you get the Church Association, otherwise known as the Persecution Company, launching a series of prosecutions in the courts against Anglo-Catholic incumbents. And this negative atmosphere dominates the Church of England in the 1850s, the 1860s, the 1870s, until an informal truce comes about in 1882, created by, of all people, Archibald Campbell Tate. Now, Archibald Campbell Tate was a Scotch Presbyterian who had become a clergyman of the Church of England. He was one of the 4 tutors who had protested against Tract 90 at Oxford in 1841. By the way, Tract 90 was condemned by 25 out of the 27 English bishops. So anybody who accepts that as a valid interpretation of the 39 Articles has 25 bishops of the time against that being a valid argument. But I just leave that by the wayside. Archibald Campbell Tate was an opponent of what he saw as priestcraft and obscurantism. He had been an enthusiastic supporter of the Public Worship Regulation Act of 1873, which allowed for the prosecution of clergymen for ceremonial irregularities in what was familiarly referred to as the Court of Wills, Wrecks and Wives, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, Chancery Division. Wills, Wrecks and Wives also dealt with cases involving shipwrecks, divorces, and probate, hence its nickname. And this became particularly notorious because of the persecution of a clergyman called Arthur McConaughey. McConaughey was of Scots descent, and he was the first vicar of St Albans Holborn. And much of what he did at St Albans Holborn was completely uncontroversial in modern terms. He put 2 candlesticks and a cross on the communion table. He wore a chasuble. He had communion every week. Somebody described the music in his church as being a mix of Wesleyan jigs and Gregorian groans. Anything he could do to reach the 10,000 slum dwellers packed tightly around his church in the East End of London, he did. He adopted watch night services from the Methodist Church. He was more interested in the cure of souls than in the rule book. And he was prosecuted time and again by the Church Association. And eventually, he was sentenced to be deprived of St Albans Holborn, which would have meant effectively unemployment for him. But Archibald Tate, who was generally speaking an opponent of all things Anglo-Catholic, quietly arranged for him to exchange his living with the vicar of St George's in the East, who was under a similar prosecution. So the dear old persecution company had to go back to square one and prosecute the both of them all over again several times over to secure the same result. But thankfully, the persecution company took the hint and backed off considerably at pursuing ritualist incumbents for ceremonial irregularities after Archbishop Tate arranged the exchange between these 2 clergymen. Poor old McConaughey died in a snowstorm in Scotland shortly after he'd become rector of St George's in the East. It seems that the stress have been persistently prosecuted by the Church Association had led to the onset of some form of arterial sclerosis or something. He lost his way in a snowstorm and he was found, you know, lying by the side of the path, attended by his 2 dogs, some 3 days after he went missing on a visit to Bishop Chinnery Haldane of the Diocese of Argyll and the Isles. Stanton, who swapped livings with him, continued as vicar of St Albans, Holborn until 1913. Tate died a few days after signing the paperwork that made this all possible. Towards the end of the 19th century, you have a situation where the old animosities between evangelical and Anglo-Catholic had very largely come down to an acceptable level. Both parties zealously pursued their own interests and cracked a few jokes about the other one. The one I'm particularly fond of is that at one point the Church Society, which is the Anglo-Catholic one, produced Latimer and Ridley votive candle stands in their catalogue, which is a rather naughty piece of humour. The other one is that they had their they had a tendency almost to go after livings, particularly associated with early reformers, so that one of the leading Anglo-Catholic parishes in London is Miles Coverdale's old church of St Magnus Martyr. And the old joke goes, if you go there when it's quiet, you can hear him quietly turning over during High Mass. The long and the short of the matter was that by 1900, a lot of the strife between Anglo-Catholic and Evangelical had died down, and the 2 parties were well represented on the episcopal bench. In 1900, J.C. Ryle was the Bishop of Liverpool. Stanton Dumiel was Bishop of Sodor and Man. There was an evangelical bishop of Hereford and also of Norwich. Anglo-Catholics were represented by people like Edward King, the Bishop of Lincoln. So a lot of the bishops were basically non-party men like Frederick Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Mandel Crichton, the Bishop of London. You have some rising stars in the background who are quite aggressively liberal, including my old favourite Hensley Henson, who is one of the great ecclesiastical gadflies of the early 20th century, a man who never saw a popular movement he didn't feel called upon to oppose. The church is much healthier in 1900 because it does have these distinct parties, but the old destructive strife is past. And you see positive developments in the early 20th century. Moves are made to revise the 350-year-old prayer book of the Church of England to be a little bit more user-friendly. You have the 1906 Commission on Ecclesiastical Ceremonial, which is intended to put an end to the dispute between High Church and Low Church over ceremonial matters on a permanent basis. Bishops tend to become bishops because they are exceptionally gifted clergymen, not because of their political connections. The standard of preaching probably is better than it was at the beginning of the 19th century. You still have a number of outstanding academics who are associated with the church, such as Tommy Strong, who was Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Oxford. You also have W.H. Frere, the liturgiologist, Armitage Robinson, the biblical scholar. Another biblical scholar is Westcott, the Bishop of Durham. You have a church which is healthy, both in the parishes and in the university and also on the episcopal bench. And it's at that point, around 1900, that you really come into the modern era of church life.
All
Okay,
right.
I covered a lot briefly tonight, so
Yeah.
I hope
Well,
it made sense.
we're at the 45-minute plus zone, so
That's why I
you know,
should.
we'll open that up to some questions. I mean, I have like 1,000 because you're in my zone finally, except for the early zone, which I talked about in the first lesson, but I'll let other people speak first.
Yes, Bishop. Yeah, you talked a good deal about the evangelicals and the Anglo-Catholics. When did liberalism really start to take a hold in the church of England?
Liberalism really comes in about 1830, 1840. We tend to miss the beginnings of liberalism in the Church of England because the evangelicals and the Tractarians are shouting so loud. The first English bishop to write on higher criticism of the Old Testament is Bishop, he was the guy with 100 questions to catch a Calvinist, Herbert Marsh of Peterborough in 1808. Pusey goes to Berlin in 1827 and listens to early lectures on the synoptic problem, although the synoptic problem had also been addressed by Herbert Marsh 20 years earlier. And Pusey comes back from Germany convinced of the destructiveness of higher criticism of the Bible. By the 1840s, higher criticism is being read by the English clergy. It hasn't really got a hold in the universities yet. That doesn't come until the 1860s. And a lot of early Victorian liberals are kind of lowest common denominator Protestants, like Arthur Penrhyn Stanley, who was Dean of Westminster, who was perfectly comfortable with the idea of inviting an Anglo-Catholic priest to preach at the nave service one Sunday and a Unitarian minister to give a lecture in the nave the following Saturday. It's sort of lowest common denominator Christianity, and that's where ecclesiastical liberalism comes from in the Church of England. They tended to exploit Anglo-Catholicism as a way of loosening the doctrinal standards of the Church of England, because they saw the conscience cases of people like Arthur Tooth and Father Ridsdale as an opportunity to make things like subscription to the 39 Articles less onerous. And it's this lowest common denominator approach that really gives birth to English ecclesiastical liberalism. Arthur Penrhyn Stanley is a strong supporter of it. You also find it influential in court circles because of the Prince Consort, who was a typical early 19th century liberal German Lutheran. And you have this sort of ecclesiastical rationalism is very much supported by those who are looking for a third way between evangelical and high church stroke Anglo-Catholic.
Your Grace?
So,
From a historian's perspective, dovetailing on what Father Paul was just saying, how much of an influence do you see the deism of Matthew Tyndall and Tillotson on liberalism?
Tillotson wasn't really a deist.
Really?
Yeah, Tillotson is more of a, he's part of the similar values to the Great Chew Circle. He's a Christian, but he's inclined to downplay the miraculous. Now, deism gets a good hammering from Daniel Waterland. It gets hammered again by Joseph Butler. I think what you see in Victorian liberalism isn't the deism of the 18th century. It's the rationalism of the Romantic era. This is paradoxical. It's the rationalism of the Romantic era in Germany. So you've got Schleiermacher in the background, all that sort of German scholarship of the early 19th century that gradually abandons concepts such as the plenary inspiration of Scripture in favor of picking and choosing the bits you like. There's rather an interesting comparison of Lyell's history of the Israelite people with that written by Arthur Penryn Stanley 30 years later. Lyell dwells heavily on Old Testament prophecy and how it is fulfilled in the New Testament. Arthur Penryn Stanley, on the other hand, it's basically a travelogue in his, account of his tour of the Holy Land. And that's really, the difference between the old high churchman, soaked in scripture, soaked in traditional ideas about prophecy and typology, the essential continuity between the Old Testament and the New, and the liberals of the later 19th century who see the Bible as an inspired book, but a book just the same, and therefore open to all the usual methods of literary criticism.
Now, I got a question for you. So from being the odd duck in the group of being an evangelical Catholic, and we won't even get into the Tractarian movement and where all that fits in, but, we see kind of in America, we see like 1892 Book of Common Prayer, which for me is like the great book for us as like coming out of the Virginia movement, the evangelical movement. And then if you kind of take what the Tractarians are saying, you grab it. You're like, okay, this is the book. Mm-hmm. But then we see the transition to the 28, which, we really see in the late 1800s, this whole movement in the church of stained glass windows. We're bringing back, the vestments. We're moving into that direction to where we see the whole change in 28. I mean, we're literally looking within a span of the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century within like a small, in terms of church history, 30 years is literally a small time frame. Did that same progression, because we have the Anglican Missal being produced and coming out at the same time right after I know this is next week, but we're actually seeing that last half. We're seeing that change from the evangelicals losing kind of that whole power structure in America and the Anglo-Catholics taking over. Do we see the same influxation in England at the same time?
No. Because the English bench of bishops has some prominent and very active evangelicals on it. J.C. Ryle is succeeded by Francis Chavas. Francis Chavas is a strong evangelical. When he retires, he's succeeded by A.A. David, who's another evangelical. You've got Edmund Arbuthnot Knox at Manchester, another strong evangelical. You have in the 1960s, you have Christopher, 40s, 50s, and 60s, you have Christopher Chavas as Bishop of Rochester. You have Hensley Henson, who was no evangelical but a very determined Protestant, as Bishop of Durham. So you don't have the same drift in England. The American church is very much more prone to the influences of movements than the Church of England, because you have a situation here where whoever captures the, I want to say the episcopate, but it's not quite that simple. It also involves the seminaries. What you have in America is a progression. You start in 1787 with the Latitudinarian Church. At the end of the 19th century, as part of that general reaction against the French Revolution, which is as much part of American culture as it is British, though in a very different way, you get the rise of evangelicalism in Philadelphia and a resurgence of the old high churchmanship in New York. The Tractarian movement comes into North America through New York. The evangelicals, their home base is Virginia Seminary. You know, it's up on the hill at Alexandria. And then at the end of the 19th century, as German biblical scholarship comes crashing into America like a battleship into a duck pond, you have really the death of the old evangelicalism, because the old evangelicalism shared its theology with, you know, the Presbyterians who came out of Princeton. So, for instance, Hodges. And as a result of biblical criticism, you get the move towards what we think of today as mainline Protestantism, which is basically liberal. It has a liberal attitude to Scripture. It has a liberal attitude to social institutions. It has a liberal attitude to the institution of the church. And a lot of old people who would have been leaders in the evangelical movement, like Phillips Brooks, become liberals. And that's where evangelicalism has its problem in America. It loses a generation of leadership as biblical criticism becomes well known in America in the decade or so after the war between the states. Also, high church bishops like Henry Potter of New York, Whitehouse of Chicago, use the church disciplinary machinery to bear down on evangelicals in their diocese. And you get an atmosphere in the late 1870s where evangelicals don't feel safe in the Episcopal Church. And some of them go off and found the REC. Others drift into Presbyterianism or Methodism because they no longer feel at home in the Episcopal Church. And predictably, by about 1910, the two dominant parties in the Episcopal Church are Anglo-Catholicism and liberal Protestantism. And this is to remain the case through the rest of the 20th century. But one thing I don't want you to get hung up on is an idea that the church in America somehow became ritualist early in the 20th century. It didn't. An old priest in the Diocese of Arizona used to love to tell the tale when he was on his second or third glass of wine, that when he came into the Diocese of Arizona in 1960, there was only one parish that used Eucharistic vestments in the whole diocese. So, you know, this move towards Catholic externals is something that arises post-World War II through the educational material that's put out by 815, Episcopal Church Headquarters, which is written by a group that's mainly dominated by liberal Catholics. Although it's rather amusing, one volume's written by Pike before he went totally crazy. And I think it's the one on the doctrinal basis of the church. You know, you have this move towards liberal Catholicism in the 50s and the 60s. the 1928 book is basically a compromise between the liberals on the one side and the Catholic leaning on the other. So you get things like the reorganization of the communion service into a more traditional format, which would satisfy the Catholic side. But you also have the retention of the rather latitudinarian phraseology in, say, the baptism service or in the marriage service, which would satisfy the liberal Protestant side. 1892 really reflects the ideas of the 1850s, the 1860s, where you have a strong evangelical movement and a increasingly vocal Tractarianism, and it actually satisfies the agenda of both parties quite well. The 1928 book is actually a little bit more liberal than that of 1892, particularly when it comes to its daily office lectionary, where you see things like the second half of chapter 1 of Romans go missing, because, you know, they no longer want to have these heavy discussions about morality. Sorry, that went all over the place.
Yeah, I don't even want to get started on the 28, because I'm a 92 guy. So, hey, anybody got any more questions? Because we are now over our 15-minute question and answer session. I don't want to keep, I know we're running late because of the Archbishop problem. Anybody got another question for him?
Don't be shy.
No, I'd like to follow up with the discussion you were just having here. Is that right now, by our canons and constitutions for the UECNA, we're supposed to go with the 1928 Book of Common Prayer. And, you know, long term, because I know you have to work with the people of each church and such. You know, Archbishop, kind of what direction would you like to go long term? What would you like to see strengthened? What do you think should be reduced? Would you see as a better thing to go back to the 1892, or would it be better to come up with a completely new prayer book, which is a historic Christianity?
I absolutely loathe the idea of a completely new prayer book. That kind of absolutely scares the bejeepers out of me. What I tend to favor is a retention of the 1928, but moving towards standing permission for the use of older liturgies. And the one thing you have to be very clear about when we say the 1928 prayer book is you're not tied to that 1943 lectionary. One of the things that, you know, I would be open to considering is restoring the 1892 lectionary for the daily office, because that doesn't involve getting into the complicated canonical process that's involved in revising the meat and potatoes of the 1928 prayer book. The prefatory material, such as the daily office lectionary, are covered under a different section of the canons to the actual basic text of the prayer book. And I think I've probably just opened a can of worms by saying that, but but the 1892 lectionary is a better lectionary than that of 1943, and probably better than that of 1928, all things considered.
I do have to agree, but even the English version of which I use in my morning and daily prayer, and don't have it in front of me, and I can't remember, is the English, is it the 1887 or 1892?
The 1892 lectionary is based on the 1871 English lectionary.
Yeah, and that is for morning and evening prayer. You still basically take the original tenets of reading the Old Testament once a year, the Psalms every Sunday, and the New Testament 3 times a year, which the American lectionary in the 28, and we still have the Apocrypha in there.
Mm-hmm.
When you 28 just totally slaughters it. I won't even use the 28 for my morning prayer. I have to grab my books. They're on a different.
The English 1871 lectionary covers about 80% of the Old Testament.
Yep.
40% of the Apocrypha, mainly the historical books, and
Yep.
the whole of the New Testament twice, except for Revelation, which they go through once.
Yes, and yeah, I'm trying to scan through here. I have it somewhere, but that's the one I got printed out. But yeah, that's a whole different discussion that we could spend hours.
Yeah,
cruising down. Yeah,
there's a funny story about the 1871 lectionary in England. It was given to Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, to revise, who was William Wilberforce's son. He was too busy, so he handed it off to Richard Genevieve Trench, the Archbishop of Dublin, who handed it off to the rector of Balbriggan, who handed it off to his curate. So the lectionary that we have in the 1871 lectionary that we use with the 1662 prayer book today was written by the curate of Balbriggan in County Dublin.
Yes, it's the 1871 lectionary. Is what I do.
It's a chapter of the Old Testament, a chapter of the New Testament at every service. Yeah,
I use that every day. So I switched back. I think that's like phenomenal, encapsulating everything you really need to get. The 28 just doesn't grab it, but
the 28 is basic. Well, the 28 prayer book lectionary that we use now isn't 1928.
No,
the one that's printed now is 1943, and the 1943 lectionary, listen to my words carefully, incorporates the latest results of biblical scholarship. Go away and think about that phrase for a moment, and you'll realize it's not a compliment.
I got you. All right. Well, hey, we're almost running on 8 o'clock tonight. Anybody got any further questions for His Grace? All right. Good deal. So,
and if you've got a minute between now and Sunday, just say a quick prayer for St. Paul's, Lexington. I'm off down there on Sunday. And they're doing the old thing of throwing the bishop to the lions before making a decision as to whether or not to join us.
Well, absolutely, they're going to join us.
I hope so.
I think they will. I mean, I think there's a lot of other callings going on around here, so I believe they will.
Mm-hmm.
Archbishop, you've done a great job, especially since coming back, kind of bringing back our diocese and helping us grow, and even the UECNA. So, hey, but will you lead us in prayer and hopefully helpful reflection into all of what we need to do this week?
Mm-hmm. Let us pray. O God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, our only Saviour, the Prince of Peace, give us grace seriously to lay to heart the great dangers we are in by our unhappy divisions. Take away all hatred and prejudice and whatsoever else may hinder us from godly union and concord. And as there is but one body and one Spirit and one hope of our calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, so we may be all united in one heart and one soul, united in one holy bond of truth and peace, of faith and charity, so that we may with one mind and one mouth glorify Thee, and faithfully set forward the glories of Thy gospel through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thanks, everybody. Hey, Archbishop, I'm going to give you a call in a couple minutes,
Okay.
if that's all right.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Okay. Good deal. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, good night.